The literacy crisis is scary. Reports that 21% of adults in the US are illiterate and that 54% read below a 6th grade level don't exactly make you optimistic about the country's future. But within quieter corners of culture, a kind of renaissance is emerging, one fueled by a small group of people encouraging a new cohort to read more than even many esteemed academics of past generations. And if it catches on, we could see this trend spread across more youth subcultures, making reading feel genuinely cool for the first time in, well, ever. So how do renaissances like this actually come to fruition? What defines a literary renaissance in the first place? And how do we turn something niche into something mainstream? Those are the questions I want to try to answer in this video. To explain why I believe a renaissance, specifically a literary renaissance, is spreading, I want to look at patterns from the past, particularly the renaissance that we typically think of when we hear that word. The Renaissance was a European period of history and cultural transformation roughly spanning the 14th to 17th centuries. It represented a rebirth of the art, architecture, and literature of classical antiquity, specifically ancient Rome and Greece. Artists began rediscovering techniques that had largely been forgotten during the Middle Ages. Linear perspective allowed painters like Brunelleschi and later Leonardo da Vinci to create the illusion of depth on a flat surface, changing how reality could be represented in art. Writers turned back to classical texts, studying Cicero and Virgil, which helped spark the rise of humanism, a worldview that placed greater emphasis on human experience, individual potential, and worldly life instead of religious authority. The printing press, which I've talked about in previous videos, and its connection to rising literacy rates, accelerated this transformation even further. Books were now able to be reproduced at scale, dramatically increasing access to knowledge. Literacy began to spread beyond clergy and elites, and ideas moved faster than ever before. In other words, the Renaissance was an amalgamation of technology, culture, and curiosity, creating a constant feedback loop of innovation. New tools made knowledge more accessible, that accessibility created new audiences, and those audiences desired more creation. But before we even try to compare anything in the present day to that Renaissance, we must first understand what's arguably more important for the purpose of this video, which is the period that came right before the Renaissance. The period that came before the Renaissance is often referred to as the Late Middle Ages, a time many historians describe as socially unstable, intellectually constrained, and defined by uncertainty. By this point, Europe had endured centuries of feudal hierarchy, where knowledge was concentrated among a small educated class and most people had little access to books, formal education, or intellectual life. Literacy rates were incredibly low, and for the average person, ideas were inherited from whoever dominated your attention, which most likely came from your family or whoever you grew up with. And you had little room to escape those beliefs or ideals. There were also a series of crises happening in everyday life. The Black Death wiped out nearly a third of Europe's population, destroying prominent economic systems. For many people, the world felt chaotic and directionless, and cultural life reflected that stagnation. Medieval Middle Ages artists were not primarily concerned with exploring reality or individual experience. Their goal was symbolic communication and religious devotion. Figures were often stylized, flattened, or arranged according to spiritual importance instead of the realism we associate with the Renaissance. Works like Lamentation, the Morning of Christ by Italian artist Giotto, and Maesta by Duccio are good examples of the type of art I'm describing here. Trust began to erode as well, mainly because the stability of the church was put under threat. Competing religious interpretations, political instability, and the spread of new texts created uncertainty about who controlled knowledge and what counted as truth. The church still dominated learning, but crises like the Western Schism, when multiple popes claimed authority simultaneously, undermined confidence in traditional institutions. And this is where the parallels between the late Middle Ages and our current era begin to become recognizable. Though literacy levels were historically low for the average citizen for thousands of years, we now appear to be drifting back towards a similar reality, not necessarily in basic literacy, but in deep engagement with reading and sustained thought. Additionally, the education system has begun to resemble the same kind of elitism it once held, with tuition costs rising to comically high levels and placing a proper education increasingly out of reach for much of the younger generation. We are also living through a series of crises in a world that feels increasingly unstable. Like the Black Death, though far less severe in terms of mortality, COVID locked millions of people inside for months, even years, fundamentally changing how we interacted with one another and accelerating the shift of power towards large institutions and digital platforms. Art, too, has for many people become culturally flattened, as most of our attention has been placed on fast-paced, shallow pieces of content that don't deepen our sense of meaning in the world, only the opposite. Trust in institutions, and even the idea of shared truth, has continued to erode as well. According to Gallup, public confidence in institutions such as organized religion, the Supreme Court, public schools, Congress, and the presidency has fallen to some of the lowest levels recorded in decades. And when it comes to truth itself, the spread of misinformation on social media, growing reliance on AI systems for answers, and increasing hyper-individualism have made consensus on objective reality harder to achieve than at any point in recent memory. So, much like the Middle Ages, we live in a time where crises are abundant, agreement is rare, art is uninspiring, meaning is scarce, and culture is stagnating. But as weird as it sounds, these are often the very conditions that are necessary to spark a renaissance. In the late Middle Ages, as crises exposed the limits of existing systems, people began searching for new ways to understand themselves in the world. Some scholars grew so dissatisfied with prevailing intellectual traditions that they traveled across Europe in search of forgotten manuscripts preserved in monasteries and cathedral libraries. The Italian poet Francesco Petrarch, for example, uncovered lost works of Cicero and helped ignite the revival of classical learning. Later, the humanist Poggio Bracciolini recovered previously unknown Roman texts while combing through monastic collections across the continent. At the same time, Byzantine scholars arrived in Italy carrying Greek manuscripts and teaching Europeans how to read ancient Greek again, allowing thinkers to study Plato and Aristotle in their original form. Once these works were translated and circulated, the printing press spread them rapidly, transforming these rediscoveries into a broader cultural movement. Granted, it took a couple centuries after the printing press for books to become widely affordable, but that point isn't particularly relevant when we're discussing the similarities between that period and the new Renaissance emerging. And in regards to art, I already touched upon that development earlier on in the video. The focus shifted towards realism, with artists becoming increasingly concerned with observing the natural world and representing human experience as it actually appeared. I believe that despite all the doom and gloom surrounding this generation and the sense that life is much harder for many people, a similar cultural shift is taking place right now, ironically on the very platforms often used to criticize it. People are craving the sort of cultural rebirth that began in 14th century Europe, and I'm positive that you're probably one of them. We have been using this thing long enough to realize all the disastrous effects it has on our mental and physical health. It makes bad information, negative information omnipresent, and we feel significantly dumber on the days that we scroll more than others. We want to study the past again, the same way that those poets and those artists went and scoured for classical texts in the past, and that's what people are doing. Take a look at this graph. It shows printed book sales in the United States from 2004 to 2025. Since around 2012, sales have risen fairly steadily, reaching more than 800 million units in 2020 alone. Initially, this might seem confusing. How is this the case if reading for fun in the US has continuously declined since 2003? Well, it can mostly be explained by a select group of people reading more than ever before, and if I had to guess, a huge part of that group of people and the increase in sales is coming from Book Talk. Book Talk is a name given to a sub-community on TikTok where people share book recommendations, reviews, and creative videos about books. Now, people have a lot of criticisms about Book Talk, and some of that is rightly justified. Questions about whether people genuinely care about reading or simply want the intellectual aesthetic of books, along with concerns that modern publishing often prioritizes marketability over artistry, are valid critiques. But there's also something else that I've been witnessing that is pretty exempt from these critiques, which is a revival of the classics. One book I've seen absolutely blow up on social media recently is The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. It seems like everyone and their mothers are talking about this book. It is on YouTubers' book recommendations, it's on TikTok, it's even on Twitter. And at the time I'm recording this video, the Penguin Classics version, the version everyone promotes, is completely sold out on Amazon. There is now a huge demand for books that restore ancient knowledge and require an immense amount of comprehension, literacy, and patience to get through. Again, you could argue that some of this is performative, but genuinely, who gives a shit? Would you rather see someone reading The Count of Monte Cristo on the train and then potentially getting labeled as performative, just doing it because, they want to seem kind of mysterious and like they're above people? Or would you rather have them continue to feed their brain endless slop in the form of short-form content? Another author gaining serious traction later is Fyodor Dostoevsky. His books were once confined to mostly high school or college literature courses, but now people are picking them up voluntarily for fun, including myself. Even just a decade ago, I feel like this would have been unheard of. In 2016, social media itself was the thing everyone wanted to understand and master, not dense 19th century novels. But in many ways, we've kind of come full circle, largely driven by cultural fatigue from the very technologies that shaped that era. So this is why I believe we're at the beginning of a literary renaissance. After years of being deprived of meaning, depth, genuine artistry, and healthy forms of escape from the speed and monotony of modern life, a small group of trendsetters began searching for what felt lost as technology seeped further into our daily routines. And as more and more people pick up on this trend, which I feel like is inevitable, how much longer can we put up with this corporate, money-hungry, gamblified slop internet that has now been created? More everyday people will return to literary works that have stood the test of time, as we are already seeing. Listen, I know my videos are usually focused on raising awareness about all the negatives that are happening in the world and why they occur, and that's partly because negative reinforcement is often more effective at motivating change than positive reinforcement. I'd also be lying if I said videos with a darker tone tend to perform better on social media. But this video is finally an excuse to say something I've always believed. At the end of almost every dark period of humanity comes a revitalization of cultural evolution, art, connection, and optimism. So lean into this trend. Return to the slow, deliberate act of reading difficult texts. Place yourself in environments that bring out that version of you. Consume content consciously that pushes you towards depth rather than distraction, and help create spaces that make reading and reflection feel natural again. I'll leave a link in the description to some of my favorite books that I've read in the past half decade, which has been the amount of time that I've kind of been reignited into reading, some of which aren't even classics. Let me know what you think about all this in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, I think you'll like my post-truth era of society video, how trust and truth, the meaning of truth, what even is truth, has kind of eroded over the past few years, especially with the internet and AI and all this misinformation bullshit. And yeah, that's it. Goodbye.